I'm recording.
Okay.
Anil, can you hear me?
Okay.
I want to.
Can we start?
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to record.
I allowed you to do. Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Esteban.
Sí. ¿Empezamos?
Sí.
Bueno, buenos días a todos a este seminario de la presentación del libro de Manuel Gonzalo sobre India desde una perspectiva latinoamericana. A mí me gustaría introducir esto hablando sobre el International Development Economic Associate, sus objetivos y lo que planteamos en la extensión de esta red de economistas para América Latina. International Development Economic Associates es una red pluralista de economistas heterodoxos dedicados a la enseñanza, investigación, difusión y aplicación de análisis crítico de la política económica y el desarrollo económico. Ideas International Development Economic Associates se estableció por la necesidad de fortalecer y desarrollar alternativas al paradigma económico dominante. Ideas tiene su sede en Asia. Su trabajo ha estado centrado esencialmente en los países de Asia y África, y ahora se expande su institucionalidad y esfera de acción a los países de América Latina y el Caribe. Los objetivos de Ideas para América Latina y el Caribe es congregar una masa crítica de economistas progresistas, heterodoxos, con el fin de abordar varios temas, entre los cuales está fomentar y desarrollar el análisis crítico plural interdisciplinario, crear un medio internacional para intercambio de investigación económica y experiencias, para la formulación de políticas económicas, promover grupos de trabajo, para divulgar y visibilizar los problemas que enfrenta la región y promover el intercambio de actividades de investigación, diseño y formulación de políticas, reforzando los vínculos entre las comunidades académicas, sociedad civil, organismos internacionales y los responsables de política económica, social y ambiental. Es en este contexto y con estos fines que damos paso entonces a la presentación de este libro por Manuel Gonzalo. Le doy la palabra entonces al moderador, que es Pablo Borso.
Well, thanks, Esteban. I will do the presentation in English, and the whole presentation by Manuel and the discussions will be in English. Let me introduce who will have the pleasure of hosting in this webinar. The presenter will be Manuel Gonzalo. He will present his book. Manuel Gonzalo is an economist with extensive experience in the field of economic and industrial development. He got his master's degree in economics and industrialization from the National University of General Sarmiento, Argentina, and completed his doctoral degree in economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He is currently professor at the National University of Quilmes, National University of Chilecito, and coordinator of the South Asia Working Group at the Argentine Council for International Relations in Argentina. Manuel Gonzalo was also a visiting researcher at the Center for Development Studies in Kerala, India, and at the Institute of Economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. His primary research focus is on India and comparative development. Furthermore, he has conducted research on innovation and entrepreneurial systems, as well as industrial and science, technology, and innovation policy. There will be two discussants of his book. One will be Sumangala Damodaran. She's a professor at the Institute for Human Development in New Delhi. Sumangala Damodaran is both an academician and a musician whose expertise spans teaching and research in economics, development studies, and popular music studies. She has taught in Delhi University and Ambedkar University in Delhi over a period of 3 decades and is currently Director, Gender and Economics with International Development Economics Associate Ideas. As a development economist, her research and publications focus on industrial and labor studies, and more specifically on industrial organization, global value chains, the informal sector, labor, and migration. Apart from her academic involvements as an economist and social scientist, she is also a singer and composer. The second discussant is Professor Alex Thomas. Alex is professor at Asimpremji University in India. His primary area of research is the history of economic thought, with a special focus on classical political economy. Alex has given more than 100 invited lectures in the areas of history of economic thought, classical political economy, heterodox economics, and teaching of economics in the last years. Some of these lectures are available on his YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@AlexMThomas, and I recommend you to subscribe. His most recent book is Macroeconomics: An Introduction, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, and he has many other papers in international journals and chapters in books. You can visit his website at asimpremsiuniversity.edu.in, and you will find his website. Having introduced all the presenters, Manuel, the screen is yours. You have around 30-35 minutes. I will tell you 5 minutes before the time, so in advance. Then the idea is for Sumangala and Alex Thomas to have 15 minutes of discussion, comment, suggestion, etc. each, 15 minutes each. A quick rebate by Manuel and response, and then we will open the floor to questions and comments from the people in this webinar. Without further delay, Manuel, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Pablo, Flor, Florencia, Esteban, and Ideas. Well, I am really happy to be here. Also, to have Sumangala and Alex as commentors or debaters. For me, it's a pleasure to have two Indian scholars discussing my book. So I am really happy with this presentation. I will share my screen. Is it okay with the screen?
Yes, I can see it clearly.
Perfect. So I will present not the whole books, only I will focus in the last part of the book. But I will try to pass you an idea about the general idea of the book. Yeah. Well, the objective of the book was to present a long-term understanding of the Indian economic development path from a Latin American perspective. And in this sense, the book pays main attention to the geopolitical, technological, financial, and institutional aspects of mainly of the Indian subcontinent and of the Indian Ocean. The book is a subproduct of my PhD thesis, that was oriented by José Casiolato and Eduardo Crespo at Universidad Federal de Rio de Janeiro. And I also make a fieldwork in India, mainly based at CDS under the supervision of K.J. Joseph. Also, I spent some days at Indian Institute of Science, Indira Gandhi Institute with Professor Nagaraj, IIT Delhi, and IIT Bengal. The book for me, it was a main effort to understand the Indian history. So the book presents an in-depth review of Indian authors. There are many maps and data and statistics. And in some sense, the objective of the book is summarized in this initiative of ideas, in the sense that I think that the book is useful for Latin American scholars that would like to have an heterodox view of the Indian history, and for South Asian scholars that would like to know some insights and Latin American authors. Well, this is the book. The book has mainly 3 parts. The first part discussed the peripherization mainly of the Indian subcontinent. The second part discussed on the building of the Indian state, paying special attention on the Indian national innovation system and its challenges. And the third part of the book tries to give a discussion on the Indian growth acceleration and its geopolitical position nowadays. So, as I said, it's like a long-term view of India with 3 main parts or discussions. The conceptual approach, in some sense, it's a Latin American building with 3 main blocks. The CLAC approach in the sense of historical structuralism, center-periphery approach, mainly Prebisch, and the idea of structural heterogeneity of Aníbal Pinto. This is the block of mainly a CLAC. Then there's some contributions on interstate competition and that they are blended with a broad idea of national system of innovations. These are mainly scholars such as Medeiros and Fiori related to geopolitical issues. And this discussion on the national system of innovation is mainly given by Redesist in Rio de Janeiro, mainly Casiolato and Lastres. And the third part of the book, and the third block, conceptual work block, is this discussion on demand-led, mainly going from a Keynesian Kalekian approach to a Sraffian approach, in the sense that the investment is fully endogenized. I mean, it responds to some exogenous expenditures. So this is simple, the main 3 blocks of the book, the main 3 conceptual blocks. The first part, that this is the first one, the peripherization, tries to introduce mainly the Indian Ocean and the Indian subcontinent. So it's mainly an introductory part of the book. I will not give so much attention on this part because here there are 2 South Asian scholars that then could give more attention on this. But the main idea of this part of the book was to discuss the peripherization of India. This is mainly the data that perhaps we all know, in the sense that India and China were at the middle or at the end of the 18th century, the center of the world in terms of industrial production. And in less than 1 century, this participation has decreased in a huge way. There are mainly 2 processes behind this process. This is one process was the Industrial Revolution, and the other process was the British penetration in Asia. So this is mainly the discussion that is given in this part of the book, and I will try to summarize what I tried to say in this first part. In this first part, I mainly try to present how India went from going a regional center to a global periphery of the British Crown, and why this is important for Latin American scholars. Well, we are mainly trained to think in a peripheral way, in some sense. We are always thinking and discussing on external sector constraints, terms of trade, import inflation, industrial competitiveness, but the Indian subcontinent peripherization is really useful for us, in the sense that, in some sense, we were inserted into the global capitalism as a periphery, but the Indian subcontinent was deindustrialized to convert in a periphery. So it is a really much more drastic and more deepened process. In this sense, this peripherization imply, of course, a set of price and non-price mechanisms. I mean, violent and non-violent mechanisms this mechanism implied the logistic and trade control coordinated by the British actors, the territorial penetration and urban restructuration of the Indian subcontinent, the structural change of the Indian economy, I mean, mainly the industrialization, and the institutional, infrastructure, financial, and autonomous expenditure subordination of the Indian subcontinent to the British needs and demands. With a completely different demographic and natural resources structure to Latin America, the Indian British-led export-led model was a disaster in terms of growth, economic development, and social welfare. Then this is like the first part of the book. Now I will try to present the second one. The second one mainly express the Indian growth acceleration, in the sense that if we have a long-term look at the Indian growth in the last 1.5 centuries, we can see that India has experienced an acceleration of its growth process. But I mainly discuss in this part of the book the Indian state building, and I present a broad understanding of the Indian national system of innovation. This implies, for example, to give account of the interwar period and how the national movement was configured during this period, and also how the Indian social heterogeneities were corn during this period. Also, the Nehruvian state building. This is one part of this part of the book. Then the Indira Gandhi period is discussed in terms of the different shocks that the Indian economy experienced, the radicalization of the economic policy and the technological efforts made during this period. The 80s are really interesting in the sense that there were like a mix of liberalization, increase in government expenditure, and also an increase in external debt of India. All in that, India in the 80s, India experienced a growth process, and for us it was a lost decade, so it's really different from Latin America. So I would like to stress some similarities and difference to the Latin American experience. Well, of course, that the role of state was important. Latin America also have an inward-looking industrialization. And at the same time, also India and, for example, Brazil experiences industrialization with marginalization. These are common aspects between the Latin American and the Indian experience. However, there are differences. For example, in the Indian case, there were much more state-owned enterprises, and the approach was much more science-led and a linear model in India. The 80s were a lost decade for us, but for India it was a decade of growth. And in this sense, after even during the 80s, India had a low external debt and FDI. And one of the hypotheses of the book is that this close, development model, in some sense, give space to these days in order to increase external debt, increase FDI. And during this period also, the paradox of the moon and the ghetto is really present in the Indian national innovation system, in the sense that India have managed to achieve really interesting success in terms of, for example, a nuclear or space program. But at the same time, there are different segments of the Indian society that have main inclusion problems that cannot be solved with the Indian science development. So this paradox that is introduced by Nelson to discuss the US is really interesting to discuss the Indian case. But I will, this is some of the the military complex of India, but I will try to focus on this part. If I still have time. How is the time, Pablo?
It's perfect. You only took 12 minutes, so you still have lots to
Okay. Good. So I will try to deepen in this part, in the sense that this is the part that present the Indian growth acceleration. And I try to, as I said, of course, that I make a review of the Indian authors. I will present it in a few minutes, but I try to introduce a demand-led approach to the Indian growth, because as we all know, what is most said is that India has a huge development in terms of exports, software exports, and it is true. But at the same time, when I was making my PhD thesis, and when we were discussing with my professors and also with Crespo and Casiolato, we suspect that there were a different internal process of India that were not captured, and that these internal drivers could explain the growth process. So I will now present an interpretation on this growth process. From the 90s to the 2015, mainly private consumption was the driver, followed by public and private contribution to investment and exports. How can we give a narrative to this process? Upper class and caste autonomous consumption, mainly fueled by credit boom and global capital inflows. Government and private investment in infrastructure, construction, and real estate, mainly linked to energy and urbanization. Of course, that exports growth in the sense, and they were mainly explained by the particular role of the Indian diaspora in the US and the complementation between the Indian capabilities and the US IT outsourcing opportunities. And finally, government expenditure, despite the liberalization, despite the pressures in order to reduce the state presence in the economy, government expenditure did not decrease after 25 years of the implementation of the new economic policy. So this is like a little bit of the relevant, India is, as we all know, India is having a main place in the actual geopolitical discussion, in the sense that the Indian Ocean is of main importance to the US, in particular to the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So, in the last months, Moody was in the US, also in France, and he was received as a main leader. For the US, India is having a main place, and this gives more space to India in terms of, for example, India have in the last 3 decades 6% GDP fiscal deficit, and there are not many issues discussed by IMF about the Indian fiscal deficit. But well, I will focus on the growth process, yeah? In the book, I cluster some growth interpretations. One is the idea of liberalization and trade. The main scholar of this is Bhawati, but also Panagarija. These are the main scholars explain the growth process because of the Indian liberalization. And they mainly said that it is mainly led by export and an increase in the efficiency of the Indian economy. Then we have some, we could say, neo-Keynesian scholars that say that there was like an attitudinal shift and an improvement of the business environment, for example, Roderick, and this pushed investment in India. Then we have some neo-Marxist or Marxist that we all know, and they are main reference here at ideas such as Chandrasekhar, Ghosh, also Baduri, that have a mixed explanation, mainly consumption, construction, upper class consumption, a little bit of investment. It depends of the papers. We can find different explanations, but they make a main emphasis on this idea that this growth is mainly a financial-led growth. Yeah, and then we have two more interpretations that they are not fully demand-led. There's one interesting paper of Nell that mainly explain growth because of export and government expenditure. There's also a paper of Bernengo and an Indian scholar that they make a mixed explanation of export and consumption. Also Rashid, I really like the work of this Indian scholar. He also make a mixed explanation, but that this includes domestic private consumption, export, and government expenditure. And finally, we have some eclectic approaches to the Indian growth that, for example, Deepak Nayar, that it's a really interesting Indian scholar that make an explanation that it is mainly institutional, but it is not clearly defined which is the channel to growth. Also, Bardan present an interesting explanation, mixing export and upper class consumption. Also, Nagaraj, that it's like an Indian structuralist, present a mixed explanation of export, investment, foreign investment, and real estate. The composition of the Indian growth process gives these results, in the sense that mainly household final consumption is a main driver. Then we have investment of gross domestic capital formation, and also then exports, and then government. Yeah, so this is the main decomposition of growth, and this is the narrative. I mean, I will change the order in the sense that when we look at the Indian narrative, the first part is the export-led approach, and now I am changing the causality in the sense that there are main internal growth drivers of the Indian growth process. I already speak about these growth drivers, so I will show you some data to support this interpretation. This is the increase on the participation of credit in the Indian economy since the 90s to the 2010. Credit goes from 20% of GDP to 50% of the GDP. It's a huge increase on credit. I mean, there are some scholars that speak about of a credit boom. Then we have salaries, in the sense that, of course, we all know that the Indian labor market is still mainly informal, around 60–50% is informal. But that said, salaries in the formal sector, not at the level of China, but they are growing. Then we have public and private investment. In some years, infrastructure investment reached 8 points of GDP. For us, from Latin America, this is huge. We are Latin America average of infrastructure expenditure is less than 3%. So 8% of investment in infrastructure investment is really important, mainly focused on energy and transport. Yeah. When we go to India, we see that there are huge avenues that are being built in the middle of some neighborhoods that the streets are made of barro. Well, I don't know the English for this, but well, I will look at this, for example. Real estate has gone from 9% of the gross domestic capital formation to 26% of gross domestic capital formation. This is huge, and this expresses what I was trying to present, that is the implications that the urbanization is having in the Indian economy, in the sense that a huge process of construction and real estate development is being there. For example, construction has gone from 1% of GDP to 4% of GDP. And the main decrease is in agriculture, as we all can suspect, from 20% of GDP to 7% of GDP. This for me is really, impressive. These are type of houses in India. Puka house is a house that is mainly built with brick, cement, and have electricity. This has passed from 67% to 93% in the case of urban houses, and in rural houses, from 17% to 65%. So, India has experienced an structural change in the type of building. We could say, well, but it was a type of building that was really old in terms of technology. Of course, it's true, and we can discuss the heterogeneity of this process, and it is true. For example, Yayati Ghosh has different articles pointing that this process is heterogeneous, and this is true, but at the same time, the main trend is that the construction is having a main relevance and a main structural change in the Indian economy. Now we can see the electricity process, the electrification process going from 45% to 77%, and if we go ahead, I think that now this is even more. So the electrification process is reaching the rural areas. Of course, this process is being heterogeneous, and this also increases inequalities. But in terms of to explain growth, this is of main importance. And in the mainstream views, I don't see this explanation being presented. This is the role of state, the GDP expenditure. So we see that even that when there is a decrease in the participation of the government on GDP, but in each crisis we see an anti-cyclical movement in terms of, and the government weight in the economy increase. So going for the dynamic of the external sector, of course, the diaspora was really important in terms of IT, but one aspect that is even more important than diaspora than IT sector and FDI is remittances. Around 3.5 GDP of remittances, mainly from the US, Arab countries, and UK. Also US capital inflows. There are some papers and works that discuss India as an international hotspot for financial capital. So this is the role of exports, and we can see that exports have grown, and this is important. Also, in particular, 1/3 of these exports are mainly service exports. So it is true that IT has a main relevance. Now, this is remittances. We can see a real increase in remittances. These are some of the main countries in terms of remittances of the world, and India is there. India and China are leading this process. I listened to a presentation of Esteban Perez in Rio de Janeiro, and he was speaking about the difference between GDP and national income. Well, of course, that remittances are important to national income. These are mainly the link with the Indian American population, in the sense that we all know that there are many Indian CEOs of the Indian IT companies or big tech, and how we can explain this process in terms of the external account balance of India. Well, mainly, I think that this is, I thought that I have another one, but okay, in the last well, two decades, we can see that foreign exchange reserves have really increased, yeah. Despite this, the result in terms of exports and import, I mean, India have a deficit in terms of a trade deficit, but this is mainly balanced with the with invisibles and foreign investment. So trade deficit is more than compensate with invisibles and FDI and remittances. Well, this, of course, I mean, this that not means that all is solved. I mean, of course, that India has a huge dependence of energy, of import of energy products from all around the world, and the structural heterogeneity is still there, in the sense that the book has one chapter that is that discuss on the, especially on this. Of course, that India have main issues of income distribution, gender, regional, religious, climate, ethnic, and technological heterogeneity. I worked these issues mainly with this discussion of the moon and the ghetto. I mean, India have a nuclear bomb and one of the main aerospace programs of the world. But for example, 1/3 of the population still have problems to have drinking water and toilets. And at the same time, there are many
5 minutes, Manuel.
Yeah. And at the same time, in terms of regional heterogeneity, there are many differences between, for example, the Gujarat model in the north of India to the Kerala model in the south of India. So mainly this part of the book concludes with the discussion comparing the Indian growth process with the Brazilian growth process. I mean, the discussion between Furtado and Tavares, and Serra, that is this discussion is being introduced to explain the Indian growth process. That was the Brazilian miracle of the 60s and the 70s. This was mainly led by state-owned enterprises oriented to infrastructure and real estate, multinationals, and upper-class autonomous expenditures. This process ended not in a stagnation, that was the idea of Furtado, but in a high growth model with income concentration. Yeah, this was the Brazilian miracle in this debate between Furtado and Tavares. And what I was trying to explain was a process that had many similarities with this. I mean, the Indian miracle has experienced growth acceleration with a growing growth concentration. We also have to say that if we see at most of the socioeconomic indicators, they are improving. I mean, I present some data in the book, and in the last 2 decades or 3 decades, with huge, still with huge challenges, they are improving in general terms. Of course, that the relevance of India for the US is not a minor issue, because they finance capital inflow and FDI. And still, despite the liberalization pressures, the role of the Indian state is relevant. For example, the state has gone from direct industrial production to infrastructure development, and for example, still the state-owned enterprises are relevant and even going in partnership with the Indian business groups. This is similar to the case of the Brazilian miracle. So, to conclude, when we discuss the Indian growth process, we have to have in mind urbanization, infra investment, and anti-cyclical policy, despite the Indian heterogeneity is still there. So thank you very much for the space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel, for sticking to the time. Now we can invite Professor Sumangala to make her comments, and then we'll ask the same for Professor Alex Stone. Sumangala, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. First of all, I want to thank Ideas Rack for inviting me to comment on this book. And so special thanks to all those who've organized this event. And also congratulations to Manuel Gonzalo for writing a very unusual book. I want to start with saying that this is the book had a lot of surprises. Coming from an economic context or even from a development studies kind of a perspective. I found this book to be refreshingly different, and I'm going to keep my comments very short, and perhaps to be able to start a discussion on the book, which can be taken up by those who are in the audience, and Manuel might like to respond to some of the issues that I'm posing. So at the risk of repeating some of the things that Manuel has said, and I must say, Manuel, for me, when you made this presentation, it made your book much clearer, because the book is large and it has a lot in it. So, when you have sort of extracted out of your book and put it in the form of this PowerPoint presentation, it makes things much clearer in terms of what you are trying to argue. I'm not trying to say that the book is not clear. The book is definitely clear, but it is just such an unusual book that somehow this presentation made the point even clearer. So I'm going to point out 2 or 3 things which I found particularly interesting, and I'll also then pose some questions to you on the basis of these 2 or 3 different aspects. One is, of course, just to quickly summarize, as you yourself have said, you use a Latin American conceptual toolbox to understand India's economic development trajectory from a long historical perspective, and not just in terms of just from the post-independence period or even a little bit before. So conventionally, one is used to reading analysis of Indian development, which actually separate out the pre-colonial from the colonial and the post-colonial. So in that sense, the fact that you started from really old history of several centuries before itself, I think, is a unique contribution that you've made. So now what Manuel has done is to, as in his own words, combine a heterodox political economy approach based on Latin American structuralism, Latin American contributions to interstate competition, and the broad understanding of the national systems of innovation and the Keynesian Telexian Kraftian principle of effective demand from a Brazilian perspective, in order to understand the whole idea of autonomous expenditures as long-run growth drivers. So this is a huge canvas. Now, in the first part of the book, he has explained what he calls the historical structuralist approach, which from the point of view of the Indian Ocean. Again, I want to point out that the works that actually talk about the impact of colonialism on the Indian economy during the colonial period don't really look at it as part of the Indian Ocean. In fact, I mean, very few economists really talk about it in terms of being part of the Indian Ocean world. Some historians, economic historians in the recent past have actually studied these processes. So again, Prasanna and Parasarthi, Sanjay Subramaniam and so on, who are strictly not considered, are not people who have come out of departments of economics. And so therefore to bring in that kind of economic history perspective, centering the Indian Ocean world is very unusual. And I think therefore, whether it is from a larger Brodelian methodological view of understanding regions and regions centered around water. I mean, Brodel did it for the Mediterranean, and by pointing out the Indian Ocean studies as a way of actually entering a discussion about India. I'm saying this again and again. I think Manuel's book is very interesting. So he moves away or extends the discussion beyond the idea of the drain of wealth and to a concept of peripherization. And that idea of peripherization which comes from Latin America. So the structural change that the Indian subcontinent experienced from being the main textile producer of the world to becoming a primary goods producer is something that he focuses on, and that the first part of the book is really about how the process of peripherization actually happened in the colonial period. So it takes it away from the discussion or beyond the discussion on Indian industrialization or the drain of wealth to bring it within a larger Latin American perspective, which comes from the ECLAC, and which has been so influential in understanding of post-world or Second World War development in any case. So this is I think a very important contribution, and I will ask a question about this, but I'll come to that after making my second point. In the second and third parts of the book, Manuel deals with India's post-independence development trajectory, and he looks at the political economy of Indian state building in terms of the coming into existence of the National System of Innovation, NSI, as he calls it, until the end of the 1980s, and then the change that happens from the 1990s, which broadly is the period of economic liberalization. Now here again, he makes an interesting point where he argues that he's moving away from methodological nationalism, and there he is actually introducing something new which is not there in the Indian NSI literature. According to Manuel, the way in which he is moving away from methodological nationalism is by having a broad view of the national system of innovation, which is a much more interconnected process rather than just something that is centered on a country and its achievements. So in his own words, a systemic understanding of the NSI, defining it as an open, evolving, and complex system that encompasses relationships within and between organizations, institutions, and socio-economic structures. So again, this also points to one of the questions that I want to ask Manuel, and I'll come to that in a minute. The third part of the book is where he talks about demand-led growth and the Keynesian framework, as he's calling it, which was also so influential in Latin America, and where he is actually talking about the way in which the Indian growth trajectory can be seen as a success story, and what kinds of demands have actually spurred this kind of a growth story. One of the things that also Manuel, I mean, I really didn't see in your presentation, and perhaps it's I mean, you've talked about it substantially, is that, you know, one of the key arguments that has been there from people like Prabhat Patnaik for a very long time has been that the Indian economy has been demand constrained. You know, and that the demand constraint has come from a very major dependence on the primary sector in terms of dependence of people, or to this day, almost 50% of the population is still engaged in the primary sector, right? And very, it's been one of the, if you look at it in terms of success stories, it has been one of the slowest transitions in terms of the occupational structure of the workforce. So while by the mid-1980s, India had more than 50% of India's output was coming from the service sector, it's only very recently that even, you know, 45% of the population, or more than 50% of the population, does not depend on the agricultural sector. So this is a huge paradox that is there. And given that for long periods of time, the growth rate of agriculture was very demand constrained on the Indian economy. Of course, I agree with you that certain aspects of the demand constraint have been eased with what you're calling the drivers, okay, which is in terms of particular kinds of consumption expenditure led by the real estate boom, by construction, and so on and so forth. But you know, a whole the picture that I get is that this is a sustainable story. So how then do these high levels of inequality that are seen in the country, how is that perhaps going to impact this growth trajectory? Or is it that India no longer needs to depend on, you know, 60% of its population at all to sustain growth? You know, and that can be completely ignored. So I think this is a question that one would need to consider. You pointed to it at the end when you say that there is the coexistence of the biggest nuclear and space program, and along with the fact that, you know, 1/3 of the population doesn't have access to drinking water and toilets. Okay, so where you're pointing out that this kind of growth process has come at a great cost. Now, theoretically, what then would be the concern? You know, is it that India has got rid of its demand constraint, which comes from the levels of inequality and the levels of poverty of very large segments of the population? So that is one aspect that, you know, I would have expected to be dwelt on more, but then, you know, perhaps we could respond to that. I'll quickly wind up by also pointing out just a couple of other things. And as I said, I think this is a very special book where when you talked about India in the Indian Ocean world, you know, primarily as the largest textile manufacturer, which then got deindustrialized or peripherized, as you argued. Methodologically, how do you think the insights that come from Indian Ocean studies, which go beyond the economics? You know, there is an explosion of Indian Ocean studies over the past 10 or 15 years. You know, the whole thing that the Indian Ocean world was a very special world in the pre-colonial period. And India was not only the center, right? We are also talking about East Africa. We are talking about China, of course, as part of the Indian Ocean world. We are talking about you know, various parts of the Gulf countries as also being important parts of the Indian Ocean world. I mean, the Tanzanian scholar Abdul Sharif called it Indian Ocean cosmopolitanism. So how would that kind of literature fit in with your larger analysis? That could make it much richer, I think. That's one question. And the second question that I had, which I've already mentioned, is that when you say that you're breaking out of methodological nationalism when it comes to understanding MSI, what do you mean by that? So understanding processes as interconnected, evolving, and open, is that enough for us to say we are breaking out of methodological nationalism? And the final point that I would want to make is that thinking from Latin America has been absolutely crucial to understanding post-colonial development trajectory, right? So when we teach development economics, or at least in older versions of development economics in India, in formal economics programs, we begin with Latin America. At least I did for the longest period of time when I was at the undergraduate level. So the vision that, and so to that extent, the international or the third worldism, as it called at one point, that came from whether it's a British finger thesis or whether it is Furtado or whether it is, the whole development of underdevelopment paradigm, has deeply influenced policy making in our parts of the world. So to that extent, Latin American thinking has been a part of conceptualizing post-colonial and post-Second World War development strategies. So do you think there was a retreat from that into what you're calling methodological nationalism? Is it that countries started only thinking about themselves? And, with the coming into existence of structures like BRICS, or now the extended BRICS, do you think it's some kind of a return to, an influence on one another? Yeah. So those are some of my questions. Thank you very much again for the opportunity.
No, thank you, Professor. Now we move to Professor Alex Thomas. You have your 15 minutes to make the comments you consider.
Thank you, Pablo. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me know if it is visible. Okay.
Yes,
right.
it is. Yes, it is.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me here, especially to Florencia and Esteban and Ideas. Clearly, you can see I'm a commentator because the image of the book I have is of much less quality than Manuel's. So I'm going to say a few points about, what the book is about. One, it is a narrative of India's growth story. And I think that it engages critically with Indian scholarship. I think that it is quite a novel standpoint to look at India from Latin America and explicitly make it clear, because I was just thinking that if you are in the US and you study India, you never say India from the US standpoint, right? But I think that as maybe scholars from the global South and maybe critical scholars, I thought that aspect was interesting. I also thought that the book is in the tradition of Kohli and Nagaraj's work. But I was quite surprised to see that Pulappare Balakrishnan's book, which explicitly deals with economic growth in India, was missing. And I'll maybe mention some of the other points which I thought you could include. So my comments actually are not going to be about India whatsoever. But I'm going to talk about demand-led growth, two aspects, how do we conceptualize it and how it might be applied. And I must also say something about my approach. Maybe doing history of economic thought, in particular, the Ricardo Malthus correspondence. My role today is going to be a kind of interlocutor within the realm of demand-led growth theory. I think that this may or may not be familiar, just for the audience really, but I just want to highlight that in demand-led growth theory, what is critical, and Emmanuel already mentioned it, is a growth in autonomous elements of aggregate demand. Whereas in supply side growth theories, it is a growth in labor and technology. And under the key assumptions, I would just mention here that we also want to somewhat look at what is the theory of value and distribution that is there in some of these Indian authors who have examined the growth process in India. And I'm not going to say anything more than that here. Now, what is the aim of this book? The aim is to give a demand-led growth understanding, right? And this has been mentioned many times in the beginning of the book and in the later part of the book. And my assessment is really to what extent does this really contribute to a demand-led understanding, and what might be some of the limitations, what could be some of the extensions that are possible. And this classification of growth narrative falls under liberalization and trade, business environment, neo-Marxist, demand side, and eclectics. So I'm repeating some of these points because I think it's important that this part of the growth narrative, because it's a different way of trying to classify what is the existing literature. So certainly, for instance, the question of Pulapre Balakrishnan's book on economic growth, where would that figure is a question. Or for that matter, and I'll maybe briefly mention it later, Amartya Sen and John Drace and Uncertain Glory. I noticed that you have one mention of it, but you do not really include it in your growth narrative or in the charts that you drew. So it might be interesting, and I have a particular perspective on that book, so we can talk about that. So what is, I mean, I have a certain critique of this classification that you have provided. Right? And the reason for that is the following. So if you take a look at liberalization and trade, the key drivers that you highlight are efficiency gains and competition. And my question is how, I mean, do we not classify it within the supply side approach as maybe one aspect of the supply side approach? And for instance, the authors who have written about efficiency gains and competition, what is their theoretical framework? Are they starting from a neoclassical marginalist theory of value and distribution? Is that why they are able to make this claim? At least that would be something that one is interested in. Although, and you rightly mentioned this, that although they favored exports, it's not really from a demand-led perspective. Right? There is something which from the mainstream supply side theory or from mainstream neoclassical economics, there is some idea that competition is good and maybe exports have a particular role to play in that. So I think that it needed a little more teasing out to figure out, I mean, that line of causation. Now, the second kind of classification that you have is business environment, which is particularly what you mentioned is a change in government attitude towards local business community. Again, my question is, does this not fall within the broader aggregate production function approach of total factor productivity? Everything other than labor and capital, right? So to me, this is also still within the supply side approach. Within the neo-Marxists, you've mentioned finance-led and domestic credit. And then you've noted rightly that in India, productivity has increased, whereas salaries have remained constant. And therefore, there is an increase in exploitation. But part of this explanation, at least the increase in productivity explanation, I think can easily be subsumed again within a supply side approach. So it was not clear to me, like, how do we actually classify them? I mean, are they really supply side theorists, or they are bringing in elements of some demand side explanation somewhere? Similarly, within the demand side explanations, you spoke about, or I mean, not you, but you've used arguments which talk about how good monsoons have improved rural consumption. Again, the idea of rural monsoons can also fall within the broader supply side kind of approach. So again, it was not, so I felt like at various points, the distinction in this classification between supply side and demand led was not very clear. And even in the eclectic approach, right? So these economists who are writing have spoken about institutions, which is about productive capabilities or the entrepreneurial drive. Both of them can go into the L in the aggregate production function. And therefore, again, so when I saw this classification and I went through your chapter, especially on this, I felt that most of these arguments that are being advanced by Indian economists primarily seem to somewhere implicitly adopt a supply side approach. And so then there's another kind of issue that I noticed, which is that the study of national account statistics data in India, which is at the aggregate level, as well as you've broken it down into various kind of sectors. But then there is some kind of a confusion here, because growth theory, at least the way in which demand-led growth theory or supply-side growth theory, is fundamentally talking about aggregate magnitudes. Now, using an aggregate conceptual framework to talk about sectors, I think calls for a little bit more of methodological explanation. But I must also say that most, I think, people who work in these, I don't think spend that much time on seeing how do sectors move and does it really correspond to what is happening in the aggregate. So I think there's a little bit more methodological innovation, I think, that is possible here. So just to reiterate, your explanations are primarily sectoral. It could be sectors like rural, urban, agriculture, services, fire sectors. And then, but demand-led growth theory is not talking about sectors in the kind of Straussian supermultiplier or the other versions, where they're talking about aggregate, like autonomous consumption, investment, government expenditure. So how does one move from a sectoral kind of analysis based on Indian data to an aggregate kind of thing? And I think it's not so, one needs to be a little more cautious. And I mean, to me, this was probably what I found that can be worked on really is initially in your first section, and you spoke in the presentation too, where which is the role of autonomous expenditure, right? So that Brazilian path that you spoke about to the Straussian supermultiplier, which is really the role of autonomous expenditure, and which is talking about genuine net injections into the system. But what I did not find in your analysis is the distinction between autonomous and induced consumption, or autonomous and induced investment. But I also recognize that with the data, it is difficult to do that. And now how does one break it down, right? So some of these related issues, I think, even if it is a critique of the existing literature, I was curious to know, how does competition actually explain growth? Or how do attitudinal changes explain growth? Or these economists who are saying institutions explain growth, because sometimes it reduces into being very subjective, it's quite ad hoc and very vague. And this, to reiterate, I think in all our attempts to understand economic growth, there is economic theory and then there is data that exists, but the empirical variables are driven by statistical availability. So then again, how do we move from sectoral data to sectoral narratives to aggregate narratives? Right? So this is a question that I have in general of people who work on growth theory itself. And I wanted to maybe focus a little bit on this growth channel, which you had already showed, which is table 7.1, and reiterate some of these points. I thought again that it is an extremely helpful exercise, and I think that it can go into courses on Indian economy, which look at growth, especially growth and development. But these are very different kind of, I think, methodologically and ontologically sort of different kind of categories. At one level, we have aggregates like exports, government expenditure and all. Then you have class-based consumption. Then you have efficiency and competition, which is of a different order. Then you have construction, real estate, which are about sectors, again of a different order. Right? So, I don't know how they all go together, or how is it that we can sort of accommodate it within demand-led growth theory. It's not been very clear. And I think certainly maybe in your following work, if you can look at autonomous elements of aggregate demand, and my sense and hunch is that maybe published statistics cannot be used as it is. I think that one needs to look at a little more historical accounts, and you have done quite a bit of that in other parts of the book, I felt, but not really when it came to the demand-led growth part. And I thought that these were some key reference. I mean, we can always debate about missing references, but I thought that given that you have actually engaged with quite a lot of literature, from my knowledge, I thought that these, certainly this article in EPW, which was published in 2010, which talks about a demand side kind of story, would certainly be useful. And Vineet Kohli's book, but this is probably coming from a slightly different angle, but I have I think that it might actually help you in your arguments. And then this article by Amit Bahaduri, which in your FRBM discussion, I think that politics of sound finance, which is coming from a Kaleckian standpoint, would certainly be much useful. So to conclude, I think that, the approach is extremely novel, exciting, and I think that can very fruitful. I certainly think that one needs to be more cautious, methodologically speaking, about this empirically sort of doing growth theory. And certainly I feel that more exposition of autonomous elements of aggregate demand are required, especially the distinction between induced elements and autonomous elements don't really come forward. And I think that maybe a simple analysis of growth drivers based on NAS might not really work. And I think that one of the hesitation is that, whether when we quickly do this kind of work, it gets into the growth accounting industry that the supply side, theorists have been doing for decades now. And I felt that, again, because of the way you classified these various growth channels, it was not very clear to me your position on these economists who have written about growth in India, whether they adopt a supply side or a demand-led approach. For instance, would you classify the 1991 policies as broadly supply side? Right? For instance, would you think that Drees and Sen, their understanding of growth is supply side? So this is the last slide that I have, because I thought maybe, you have of course looked at Serrano's work and engaged with it, but if you want a more historical kind of way of looking at it, I think Matthew Smith's work, which is also inspired by Serrano's work and published in Review of Political Economy, might be useful. And I was also thinking that I've mentioned Garigani's book here only because his PhD thesis in the 1960s, which inspired Serrano, is going to be published in English later this year. And maybe I feel your empirical work and us at least having access to Garigani's PhD work, all this will facilitate a lot more discussion on demand-led growth theory. And hopefully there'll be many more people who work in this domain. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for your comments and questions, and Mangala as well. Manuel, do you want to take no more than 10 minutes to reply?
I will try. Well, thank you very much to Mangala and Alex for your time, for reading the book, and for the comments. All the comments are, of course, useful. Well, related to Sumangala, I think that I will respond mainly 2 points, because I don't know if I understand one of the issues, but about methodological nationalism. My feeling when I was reading most of the Indian works on the Indian national system of innovation, that there's like an internal discussion between the neo-Schumpeterian scholars about the broad and the narrow understanding of the national system of innovation. And even though most of them, and I know that, I was there in Kerala with K.J. Joseph, they recognize the broad idea, the broad conception and implication, for example, geopolitical issues. They say that this is important, but I did not see this in most of the works that I read. So my intention there was to fully introduce a broad idea of national system of innovations, in the sense that I mean, you cannot understand the Indian technological development without understanding its geopolitical insertion in the Indian subcontinent, without understanding the Cold War. And in most of the national system innovation works, I did not see this fully applied. I mean, how the global tensions and the global networks are introduced in the national system innovation approach. Mainly, I mean, the role of a multinational enterprise, of course, this is discussed, but what I have done in this second part is more than introducing multinationals. I introduce, I mean, the effect of war, the effect of financial capital. I mean, different issues that I think that they contribute to give a more broader and more, I mean, I would not say, and not a narrow understanding of the national system of innovation, and not limiting it to India, India, India. I mean, I make a huge effort to speak about the Indian Ocean, the Indian subcontinent, and not looking India, India, India as alone. Yeah. Well, I would say this to this comment of Sumangala, and of course that, I mean, the discussion on the Indian Ocean, I really like it. I mean, it's fascinating for me. And I go from first from this like Brodelian approach of the 15th, 16th century. I mean, this work of Chowdhury for me is like really beautiful. The one of the Indian Ocean, yeah, it's this. I really use this approach. And then I come back to the Indian Ocean in the 90s and in this century. So, of course, that the discussion on the Indian Ocean is really important. And of course, that the Indian Ocean and I mean, is crossed by a civilization history. And related to what you were saying about Prevish and the BRICS and the Latin American approach, I don't know if I fully understand your question, but I think that, of course, when there are influences from Latin America to the Indian scholars, but I think that, and well, this was part of the motivation of my work, that this could really deepen much more. I mean, in the interviews that I made, I find that, for example, different scholars like Nagaraj, K.J. Joseph have in mind different Latin American scholars, but I did not feel that the discussion or the blend between the Global South economic development theory is done. So we have a lot of work to do on this. And the book was like a first step on this, and I hope that this contribute on this, and this space, of course, is really important for me in this discussion. Well, I hope that I answer a little bit of Sumangala comments and questions. And related to Alex, I mean, thank you very much for the discussion. I mean, when you introduce your classification on supply and demand, yeah, and then you analyze the Indian authors that I cluster with this classification. What I have tried to or what I did in this part of the book is only to reproduce what they said, in the sense they explain this in this way. I mean, attitudinal shift. I mean, and then I try to look I try to understand which was the channel of this explanation. But I did not want to make a discussion on if they were fully demand-led or they were fully supply side. Of course, that it is implicit. I mean, for me, perhaps Roderick is supply side, but it's implicit. It was not my intention. My intention was to respect each author with its approach and to give account of these approaches. So this related to this. the second point that, of course, I mean, as you said, I mean, I made my PhD in Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and I have 4 years of bullying of the Raffian people. So the distinction between, I mean, I love Raffian, but this distinction between sectoral and aggregate, I of course understand, but 2 or 3 points on this. One, what I have done is not to fully try to reproduce the supermultiplier as a model, and I said this in the book. I mean, I try to introduce a narrative with the supermultiplier as a background, but my intention, I mean, I am not like a modelist. I am not a quant. I mean, I mainly have the supermultiplier as a background, and my approach was mainly like a political economy approach, in the sense that I have tried to build a narrative on the Indian growth. Then, that said, I tried to make like a supermultiplier, but there were many problems with the data. So it was really, I mean, we enter in a mess. So I say, well, no, not this way. Stay with the narrative. And at the same time, I think that, of course, that in the narrative, this could be much more in terms of a fully theory guy. This could be not so, I mean, clear. But I think that the challenge is to discuss this, mixing the empirical and the narrative in the object, not to say, well, this is the model and the narrative, then you go to a book of history. I mean, I try to mix this, and of course that in doing this mix, not all the people will be satisfied, because you will, a guy that likes to make the model would say, oh, it's not it's not a supermultiplier. Yeah, it's true. And at this point, I agree with your idea of the differentiating between sectoral and aggregate. But at the same time, I think that you cannot speak, for example, of this growth process without saying the relevance of construction of real estate. And in fact, when you see different works of Ghosh, of Chandrasekhar, we can discuss this, but they try to mix this interpretation. So I follow this discussion, but at the same time, I have to say, when you say, well, it's not clear about the autonomous expenditure. No, I think that I make a decomposition, and the autonomous expenditures are clear. I mean, exports are autonomous expenditures, upper class and caste consumption is an autonomous expenditure. Government investment in infrastructure is autonomous expenditure, and credit boom is autonomous expenditure. So perhaps it's not so fully stressed, but my understanding of the autonomous expenditures are there. Thanks about the references that you give. Thanks. Then, well, please give me your presentation. I will look for this. And well, I stop here, and perhaps we can open the debate. Thanks very much.
No, thank you the commenters as well. If anybody has comments, they can either raise your hand, levantar la mano as well, or put it in the chat of the group.
Pablo,
Yes.
la profesora se tiene que retirar, tal vez quiera saludar antes de irse.
Profesora Sumangala. Sí,
Me está avisando. Sí.
Ok, profesor
Si querés dar la
Sumangala.
palabra.
You may, I heard that you have to leave the meeting. Do you want to say a bit?
Yes. No, I mean, it's a fascinating discussion, and I wish I could have stayed a bit longer. And I also want to say that I agree a lot with what Alex has pointed out in terms of because in terms of explaining the so-called growth miracle in India, the lines have been drawn quite strongly, and these lines come from logical standpoint. So in that sense, this whole idea about a consumption-driven or a demand-driven boom, which sometimes appears a little uncritical in the book, that I think is something of concern. So perhaps a better distinction being made between a supply side and the demand side explanation, and also within the demand side kind of explanation. But I said that's why I posed the question of how do you look at a demand side explanation in terms of older arguments about a demand constraint, and the demand constraint coming primarily from the levels of poverty and inequality in the country. So even if growth is managing to overcome that constraint, what is the implication in a larger political economy sense? That was my question, but I know we don't have enough time to discuss it, to that extent. And I just, I unfortunately need to leave. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and congratulations again, Manuel, for a very interesting and unusual book.
Thank you. All the best, and thanks for participating and accepting to be part of this webinar. Thanks a lot. Anybody?
Pablo, si querés,
yeah.
hay una cosa que me quedé, sorry, there was like an issue about,
Go
about
ahead, go ahead.
No, it was important, but because she pointed out the inequality, and of course that I mean I give account of this in the book, but I did not make further elaborations on this, and I'd say I don't know. I mean, in the sense that India is growing a lot, and it seems to continue with this growth process, and also the inequality seems to increase. And I think that, I mean, in some sense, this is capitalism, in the sense that this huge growth process, including an increase in exploitation, gives inequality. Only to recognize this point, only this.
No problem. I'll take again. Anybody else wants to raise their hand to put some comments in the chat? ¿Alguien quiere poner algún comentario? Alicia, yep, please go ahead. Alicia Puyana, if you want, you are muted. Estás muteada, Alicia.
Muchas gracias. Quiero felicitar a Manuel por el excelente libro, a su mandala y a Alex por los comentarios. Yo he estado pensando, digamos, a pesar del esfuerzo de explicar las fuentes y las raíces del crecimiento en India, me queda pendiente lo que comentaba Helmar en su libro ya relativamente viejo, si ustedes quieren, con la velocidad que suceden los hechos ahora, llamado The Mystery of Economic Growth. Digamos, no se sabe realmente cuáles son las causalidades explícitas, sobre todo en ese esfuerzo muchas veces basado en la econometría de explicar la causalidad exclusiva de un factor y ponderarla. Uno de los factores que a mí me sorprende se toma implícitamente.
Disculpa, Alicia, mil disculpas que te interrumpa, pero creo que para que Alex y el resto de los participantes puedan entender lo que estás diciendo, si hay un botoncito abajo, al lado, abajo del todo, donde si eliges español, tú hablas en español y hacen la traducción al inglés, así todos te pueden comprender.
Ah, ya. Entonces,
Fíjate si...
¿Ya está?
¿Ahora?
A ver, ahora.
¿Se puede
Let's see
traducir?
now.
¿No oyen? A ver, yo...
Or perhaps you want to make this comment in English? Is that possible?
Okay. Please,
Alicia?
Alex. Oh.
Yes.
Ahora sí. ¿No?
Everything who want to have the translation from Spanish to English, you should click above in English.
In English.
Okay. Now, Alicia, disculpa, pero bueno, intentemos ahora. Alicia tiene las palabras otra vez.
Ok. Gracias, muchas gracias. Quiero felicitar a Manuel por su libro, ese esfuerzo de explicar el crecimiento de India y los comentarios de su mandala y de Alex estupendos. Y trajeron a mí a la memoria el libro no muy nuevo ya de Helpman, The Mystery of Economic Growth. Queda todavía el misterio por ese afán de la teoría económica basado en la econometría de explicar cada uno de los factores en una forma exclusiva y determinante, sin contemplar la adición de los factores. Y algo que me sorprende es que no se analiza bien la escala. Se insiste en la desigualdad y en la pobreza, por ejemplo, pero por pequeño que sea el grado de desarrollo, el ingreso per cápita de un país de 900 millones o de 1.200 millones de personas comparado con uno de 200 o de 100 millones. Simplemente esa escala crea unas condiciones de crecimiento diferentes. Como decía mi profesor en Oxford, por millones aún botones de pantalones hacen fortunas. Yo creo que en mi interpretación del libro, o mi comprensión del libro y también de los comentarios de Alex, me parece que ese factor de la escala no está suficientemente desarrollado. Puede ser un error mío en la interpretación. Y el segundo, sobre todo comparando con América Latina, India y América Latina, y desde una perspectiva histórica, la la diferencia de haber sido independiente en América Latina desde el siglo XIX, empezando el siglo XIX, y luego independiente a mediados del siglo XX, el contexto histórico es muy diferente, y quizá eso también marca una trayectoria del desarrollo muy distinto entre un movimiento de independencia liderado por élites hispanófilas y un movimiento de liberación nacional liderado por élites anti-metrópolis. Yo creo que esos son elementos que pueden ayudar a entender esa gran diferencia, y reitero mis felicitaciones a Gonzalo. Un trabajo típico de ideas para congregar análisis del Global South. Muchas gracias.
Anybody else wants to have a question or a comment? If not, Manuel, would you like to reply?
No, thank you very much, Alicia, for your comments, and they are important comments in the sense, I mean, in the book, the issue of the scale, I mean, is there. Perhaps, of course, it's not fully discussed in terms of how this scale impact on growth, but it is
mentioned.
It is mentioned and in some sense discussed. But it's true that this deserves more more research. And the second point, well, this and the discussion of the national movement and the partnership between the elite and the political elite and the scientific elite is discussed in the book. I have not in this presentation. I had no time to give account of all the book, but if you look at the book, you will find some issues on this. But these 2 points are important points. So thank you, Alicia, on this.
Esteban has raised his virtual hand, so Esteban, you may go ahead.
Thank you. I just have one comment. Manuel, could you just elaborate very briefly on Alex's comments that he didn't find very clear the distinction, if I understood correctly, Alex, the distinction between supply-led or supply constraint and demand constraint growth in the book. I mean, you made reference to the Sraffians, Garignani, but there are other theories besides the Sraffian ones. So could you just elaborate a little bit briefly on this? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, for example, the ones of Bhagwati. Bhagwati, that is like the main liberal scholar. Yeah. So Bhagwati explained the growth process in the sense that the liberalization gives much more competition, and this competition gives more efficiency, and this increase exports. Well, from a demand-led, or I mean, from a super multiplier approach, exports are autonomous expenditures. So at this point, we would say Bhagwati is demand-led. I mean, I would say in their explanation, they have some components in this explanation that, of course, that from our approach or for the approach of the book is like they are autonomous expenditures. But they introduce a narrative that is liberal in the case of Bhagwati. This is one of the authors that were discussed. Then, for example, Roderick Roderick is supply. I mean, in my interpretation, is supply side. He speak about this attitudinal change, but we know that Roderick is, in some sense, is Keynesian. But but in my interpretation and in Alex's interpretation, of course, it is in some sense supply side. And for example, some neo-Marxists are much more related to a demand side approach, such as Chandrasekhar and even Yayati Ghosh. And at the same time, some eclectic ones, such as Nayar, it is, for me, I mean, in some sense, it is not clear, and I said this in the classification, which are their channels to growth. I mean, it is not clear in the text of them. I mean, they speak, for example, a lot of institutional capabilities, but how we link the institutional capabilities with growth, it's not so clear. But I mean, Alex was questioning me in some sense with some issues that are in part reflect the author's ideas. Yeah, I don't know if I am clear on this. And what I have to say is that in my interpretation, I think that it is clear which are the autonomous expenditures and which are the endogenous variables in my interpretations. And I could explain again. Of course, that export contribute, autonomous expenditure contribute, government investment contribute, credit boom contribute, and these are, for me, autonomous expenditures that drives growth. So I would say this to Esteban, but of course that this implies much more research and discussion.
Thank you very much.
Well, Alex, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I mean, actually, I don't want to feel like the second referee that everyone hates. But right? No, I think two things. One, I mean, I completely agree with you that I personally think that we should not go the model way of looking at the super multiplier or the demand-led growth and mindlessly apply. And certainly, I'm all for narrative, and which I think you've tried to do. So what I was trying to suggest is you have listed these classifications, what the authors have. Instead, I felt that if you had tried to reclassify them into supply side growth theories and demand-led growth theories, and as Esteban mentioned that within demand-led growth theory as well, I have taken a particular position. But if you were to do it with multiple strands within demand-led growth theory, for the readers, it will be clear that one, you have you are dissatisfied with the supply side growth theory. If you are, I don't know. Maybe you are not so very dissatisfied because you think there are elements that are useful. That way, I think the readers will be more aware of, some kind of analytical distinction between broadly these two sets of theories. I mean, that was the kind of point.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So I don't see any other hand. And so if nobody wants to make a comment, I think we can close up with some comments by Florencia. Florencia, I think you want to say a bit. And with that, I think we can conclude.
Bueno, yo estoy aquí del lado de español, así que ¿me escuchan la traducción en inglés? ¿Escuchan? ¿Se está traduciendo?
Yes, I can hear the
Okay.
translation.
Bueno, bien. Bueno, yo quería en primer lugar agradecer a Manuel, Gonzalo, a Alex y a Sumangala por aceptar participar en este evento con la buena predisposición. también estuve ahí en los dos lados. Muy buena fue la traducción, también contentos con esto. Esto también va a estar disponible en inglés y en español, tanto en el canal de Ideas como en la página que próximamente tendremos en Ideas LAC. Uno de los, uno de los objetivos, como mencionó Esteban y como mencionó Alicia y de Ideas LAC, es estrechar los lazos entre los académicos, especialmente de América Latina, pero también del sur global. Así que este nuevo evento es, creo que con los fabulosos comentarios que hubieron al final, es muy fructífero y muy contento con eso, que estamos cumpliendo ese objetivo. Lo que quería cerrar algunos anuncios, este espacio de Ideas LAC que estamos coordinando con Esteban y Pablo, está creciendo, así que estamos, son bienvenidas cualquier iniciativa que quieran que nosotros promocionemos o armemos alguna actividad. En el chat les dejo mi correo, si no lo ven es florencia.medici@gmail.com. Bueno, nos escriben y vamos charlando y vamos armando este espacio que bueno, es nuevo y va a seguir creciendo para difundir actividades y para armar actividades. Solo quería decir eso y agradecer, y bueno, sin más, cerramos, ¿no? Así que bueno, buenos días, buenas tardes y buenas noches.
Gracias, thank you very much. Thanks.
Bye to everybody.
Thank you very
All
much.
the best. Bye bye.
Florencia, I'm ending it.
Ok,
Okay, bye.
todo bien.
Bye, Alicia.
Right.
Hi, thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
I like your call for new cooperation and new activities, Florencia. It was great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The translation
Yeah.
was excellent.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes,
I'm
the
glad
translation was
because,
great.
yeah, Lilia is very good.
Lilia, thank you, Lilia, for all your
Okay.
support. Yeah, bye.
See you.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.